History does not always announce its turning points with the clap of thunder. Sometimes, they begin with a quiet exchange of vows in a provincial chapel. In the year 1272, when the great Gothic cathedrals were still new and the memory of the Crusades was fresh, a French prince named Robert, the youngest son of the pious King Louis IX, was joined in marriage to a woman named Beatrix. She was not a princess of a rival kingdom, but the heiress to a fertile and unassuming lordship in the heart of France, known simply as Bourbon. This union, a minor note in the grand symphony of the Capetian dynasty, planted a seed. From this seed, a new branch of the royal tree would grow, known as the House of Bourbon. For centuries, it remained just that, a branch, sturdy and respected, but far from the sunlit canopy of the throne. The Bourbons were dukes and counts, men who commanded the rolling countryside and oak forests of central France from their stone castles. They were loyal vassals, and occasionally, brilliant commanders. One such man, Louis II de Bourbon, known as Louis the Good, bled for France on the mud-soaked fields of Crécy and Poitiers during the 100 Years' War, a testament to his family's devotion. Yet, the family's fortunes could also sour. In the 15th century, a reckless Duke of Bourbon, Charles III, chose rebellion over loyalty, allying himself with the Holy Roman Emperor against his own king. His gamble ended with his death during the infamous sack of Rome in 1527, and his lands, the very heart of the Bourbon patrimony, were confiscated by the crown. By the mid-16th century, it seemed the Bourbon star had not just faded, it had been extinguished. They were a house diminished, a cautionary tale of ambition gone awry. They would never produce a king. But history, so often driven by the whims of fate and faith, had other plans. The stage for the Bourbons' dramatic return was not a royal court, but a kingdom tearing itself apart. France was consumed by a firestorm of religious hatred. The wars of religion had set neighbor against neighbor, Catholic against the Protestant Huguenots, in a brutal cycle of massacre and reprisal. The Valois dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, was withering, its kings childless and weak, their authority crumbling amidst the bloodshed. It was into this cauldron of chaos that a new kind of leader was born in 1553, Henry of Navarre. Henry was a Bourbon, descended from that same quiet line of Robert of Clermont, but he was forged in a different fire. His mother, Jeanne d'Albret, was the Queen of Navarre and a fervent Calvinist who raised him in the austere Protestant faith. His father was Antoine de Bourbon, a man of shifting loyalties. Henry grew up not amidst the perfumed silks of the Parisian court, but in the rugged, wind-swept lands of the Pyrenees. He was more soldier than courtier, more comfortable in the saddle than on a throne, a man whose charisma was as natural and unvarnished as the landscape of his youth. His life was a testament to survival. As a young man, he was lured to Paris in 1572 for a royal wedding, intended to heal the nation's wounds. Instead, it became the prelude to a nightmare, the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre. For days, the streets of Paris ran with the blood of thousands of Huguenots. Henry, a prime target, saved his own life only by feigning a conversion to Catholicism at sword point, a humiliating charade he endured until he could escape the capital. Once free, he immediately renounced his forced conversion and returned to the Protestant cause, becoming the defiant leader of the Huguenot resistance. For years, he fought a desperate war for survival, a provincial prince battling the full might of the Catholic League and the royal court. The conflict reached its crescendo in the aptly named War of the Three Henrys. It was a deadly three-way struggle for the soul of France: the incumbent but ineffectual King Henry III, the powerful and fanatically Catholic Duke Henry of Guise, who was backed by Spain and beloved by the Parisian mobs, and our hero, the Protestant Henry of Navarre. The stage was set for a final, bloody act, but then, destiny intervened with the cold precision of an assassin's blade. First, the Duke of Guise was murdered on the orders of King Henry III. Then, in 1589, a radical monk repaid the favor, plunging a dagger into the king himself. With his dying breath, Henry III, his own line extinct, recognized the unthinkable. His legitimate successor, by right of blood, was his Protestant cousin, Henry of Navarre. A Protestant on the throne of the eldest daughter of the Church? To much of Catholic France, it was an abomination. The Catholic League refused to acknowledge him, declaring him a heretic and inviting the Spanish army onto French soil to contest his claim. Henry, now styling himself Henry IV, found himself a king without a capital, a ruler without a realm. He answered with the only language his enemies understood: steel. At the Battle of Ivry in 1590, his smaller Huguenot army faced the superior forces of the League. Seeing his men waver, he tore the helmet from his head, his iconic white plume making him an easy target, and roared a command that would echo through the ages: "My companions, if you lose your standards, rally to my white plume. You will always find it on the path to honor and victory." They rallied, and they won a stunning victory. Yet for all his battlefield brilliance, the gates of Paris remained stubbornly closed. The city would rather starve than accept a heretic king. Henry, the ultimate pragmatist, understood. He had fought for his faith, but now he had to fight for his kingdom. He realized that France could not be healed by the sword alone. It needed a symbol of unity. In a masterstroke of political genius that broke the hearts of his most zealous followers but saved his country from endless war, he converted to Catholicism one final time. Paris, he is said to have remarked with a world-weary shrug, is worth a mass. With that single act, the opposition collapsed. The gates of Paris swung open, and in 1594, Henry IV was crowned King of France, the first of the Bourbon line. His reign would be the foundation upon which the modern French state was built, the beginning of a dynasty whose name would become synonymous with both absolute power and revolutionary downfall. His coronation, however, was not an end, but a beginning. The crown rested uneasily on a king who now ruled two faiths, both of which viewed him with suspicion. The Catholics remembered his Protestant past. The Huguenots saw his conversion as the ultimate betrayal. France was a fractured mirror, its people exhausted by decades of civil war but not yet healed. Henry IV, with his chief minister, the stern and capable Duke of Sully, set about the painstaking task of gluing the pieces back together. His first monumental act was the Edict of Nantes in 1598. It was not a modern declaration of religious freedom, but a fragile, pragmatic truce. It granted the Huguenots the right to worship in certain areas, to hold public office, and to maintain their own fortified towns for protection. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it was enough to silence the cannons. It was the legal embodiment of Henry's own weary pragmatism. With a semblance of peace secured, Henry turned to the land itself. He was a king who understood the soil, who famously declared his wish that every peasant might have a chicken in his pot on Sundays. This was no empty platitude. He and Sully reduced the crushing taxes on the peasantry, promoted new agricultural techniques, and poured money into rebuilding the country's arteries, its roads, bridges, and canals. For the first time in a generation, commerce began to flow freely, and the kingdom's finances, once in ruins, slowly stabilized. He ended the long, draining conflict with Spain in the Treaty of Vervins, allowing France a precious moment to breathe. He was a king who walked among his people, whose coarse humor and easy manner endeared him to the common man. He became known, with genuine affection, as Le Bon Roi Henri Good, King Henri. Yet, the shadows of fanaticism still lingered. For all his efforts to heal the nation, some could never forgive the heretic who now wore the crown. In 1610, as his open carriage navigated a congested Parisian street, a Catholic zealot named François Ravaillac leaped onto the wheel and plunged a dagger deep into the king's chest. The good king, the architect of peace, slumped dead, and the hope of a generation died with him. The crown passed to his son, Louis XIII, a boy of only 9. The kingdom, so recently pulled back from the brink, was once again cast into uncertainty. Power fell to the regent, Henry's widow Marie de' Medici, an Italian princess who lacked her husband's political acumen. The court, which Henry had filled with battle-hardened loyalists, now swarmed with her Italian favorites, most notably the arrogant and grasping Concino Concini. The great nobles of France, who had been subdued by Henry's strength, began to mutter and plot, sensing weakness at the center. Royal authority, so painstakingly rebuilt, began to fray once more. In 1617, the teenage king, quiet and sullen but possessing a core of iron resolve, made his move. He ordered the arrest and execution of Concini and banished his own mother from court, seizing the reins of power for himself. Louis XIII was not a man like his father. He was shy, plagued by ill health, and found more solace in music and hunting than in the tedious mechanics of statecraft. But he possessed a singular genius. He understood his own limitations and knew he needed a will stronger than his own to govern France. He found that will in a man of breathtaking intellect and chilling ambition, Armand Jean Duplessis, better known to history as Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu was not merely a minister, he was the architect of the absolute state. Where Henry had healed, Richelieu would build, and his tools were centralization and control. He saw the lingering power of the regional nobility and the political autonomy of the Huguenots as twin threats to the authority of the crown. He would crush them both. To subordinate the nobles, he created a network of royal officials known as intendants. These men, dispatched from Paris to the provinces, were the eyes, ears, and iron fist of the king. They bypassed the old feudal lords, collecting taxes, enforcing laws, and reporting directly to the cardinal. The ancient privileges of the aristocracy began to wither under their constant, bureaucratic gaze. Next, Richelieu turned his attention to the Huguenots. He had no desire to reignite the religious wars. He respected the Edict of Nantes's guarantee of religious toleration. What he would not tolerate, however, was a state within a state. The Huguenots' right to maintain armed fortresses, like the formidable port of La Rochelle, gave them a military and political independence that he was determined to extinguish. The ensuing siege of La Rochelle was an epic struggle, a testament to Richelieu's implacable will. After more than a year of starvation and bombardment, the city fell. The Huguenots lost their armies and their strongholds, forever ending their ability to challenge the crown. They could keep their faith, but they would bow to their king. On the international stage, Richelieu pursued a policy of cold, hard-headed raison d'etat, raison of state. He, a prince of the Catholic Church, looked at the map of Europe and saw France encircled by the two branches of the Catholic Habsburg dynasty in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. And so, during the bloody 30 Years' War that was devastating Germany, he made the shocking decision to fund the Protestant armies of Sweden and the German princes against their Catholic Habsburg rivals. For Richelieu, the security and glory of France trumped any notion of religious solidarity. By the time of his death in 1642, he had transformed France. The modest kingdom of the early Bourbons was now the most centralized and formidable power in Europe. Louis XIII, his health finally failing, followed his indispensable minister to the grave just a few months later in 1643, leaving the throne to his son, a 5-year-old boy who would inherit the awesome machinery of state Richelieu had built, and who would come to embody absolutism itself, Louis XIV. The machine of state that Richelieu had built was a fearsome engine of power, but it was now in the hands of a child. The ascension of 5-year-old Louis XIV in 1643, like that of his father before him, was a moment of profound vulnerability for the monarchy. The great nobles, who had chafed under the cardinal's iron grip, saw their chance. Judges of the high courts, the parliaments, resented the erosion of their traditional authority. The common people, bled dry by taxes to fund the endless 30 Years' War, were simmering with discontent. This combustible mix exploded in a series of chaotic uprisings known as the Fronde. For the young king, the Fronde was not a political crisis. It was a formative trauma. It was the terrifying memory of being roused from his sleep, not by a gentle governess, but by the roar of a Parisian mob storming the palace gates, demanding to see their king, guided by his regent mother, Anne of Austria, and Richelieu's cunning successor, Cardinal Jules Mazarin. The royal family was forced to flee their own capital under the cover of darkness, a humiliation that burned itself into the boy's memory. He learned a powerful lesson in those years of chaos. Disorder was the ultimate evil, and the nobility, if left to their own devices, were a viper's nest of ambition and treason. He vowed that he would never again be at their mercy. He would not just rule them, he would tame them. When Cardinal Mazarin finally died in 1661, the court's ministers gathered, expecting the now two-year-old king to name his next chief minister. Instead, Louis assembled them and made a declaration that stunned the court and altered the course of French history. There would be no more Richelieu, no more Mazarin. From that day forward, he alone would govern. "It is now time," he announced, "that I govern them myself." He would become the living embodiment of the state, a sun around which all of France would revolve. And every sun needs a proper sky in which to shine. He found it in a marshy, unpromising patch of land a dozen miles west of Paris, the site of his father's modest hunting lodge. Here, Louis would build his masterpiece, the Palace of Versailles. Versailles was more than a home. It was a political theater, a gilded cage, and the most magnificent instrument of power ever conceived. The project consumed the state's finances and the labor of thousands for decades. It grew into a breathtaking monument to glory, a city of gold and marble rising from the swamps, its glittering hall of mirrors, its vast manicured gardens designed by André Lenotre, and its hundreds of apartments were all designed for a single purpose: to domesticate the French nobility. Louis compelled the great dukes and counts of France to abandon their regional power bases and reside at Versailles. Here, their influence was measured not by the size of their armies or the extent of their lands, but by their proximity to the king's person. They were drawn into an endless, intricate labyrinth of court ceremony. They vied for the supreme honor of handing the king his shirt during his morning levee, waking, or holding a candle at his evening coucher, bedtime. Status was determined by a nod from the monarch, a whispered word, or the right to sit on a stool in the queen's presence. Trapped in this cycle of competitive triviality, their plots and rebellions were replaced by petty jealousies and struggles for royal favor. The fearsome feudal lords who had terrorized his childhood were transformed into fawning courtiers, their power neutered. From this glittering epicenter, Louis's absolute authority radiated outwards. He perfected Richelieu's system of intendants, further centralizing the state. Under his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, French industry and trade flourished, funding the king's insatiable appetite for glory. The arts served to magnify his magnificence. The playwrights Molière and Racine entertained his court, while the Académie Française worked to purify and codify the French language, making it the undisputed tongue of diplomacy and culture throughout Europe. Paris itself was transformed with grand squares and public lighting, a model for other capitals to emulate. Louis XIV was not merely the King of France, he was the Sun King, and his reign was France's grand century. But a sun casts a dark shadow. Louis's obsession with control demanded absolute uniformity, and that meant one king, one law, and one faith. The religious tolerance enshrined in the Edict of Nantes was, to his mind, an untidy anomaly, a stain on the perfect fabric of his state. In 1685, he revoked it. Protestant churches were demolished, their schools closed. Huguenots were forced to convert to Catholicism or flee the country. An estimated 200,000 chose exile. They were not peasants, but skilled artisans, innovative merchants, and disciplined soldiers. They took their talents, their capital, and their bitter resentment of the French crown to France's rivals: England, the Dutch Republic, and Prussia. The revocation pleased the Catholic clergy, but in the long run, it was a catastrophic act of self-harm, a wound from which the French economy would take decades to recover. The king's quest for glory also played out on the battlefield. Louis waged a series of relentless wars to expand French territory and assert Bourbon prestige. The War of Devolution and the Dutch War secured new lands in the Spanish Netherlands and the Rhine. Each victory was followed by a lavish celebration at Versailles, reinforcing the myth of the invincible monarch. But this incessant warfare was ruinously expensive. and it united the rest of Europe in a coalition of fear against him. The culmination of his ambition and his hubris was fast approaching, triggered by a dying king in a distant palace in Madrid. The question of the Spanish succession would soon plunge all of Europe into a devastating conflict, testing the limits of the Sun King's power and threatening to undo everything he had built. The climax of the Sun King's reign arrived not with the clash of swords, but with a death rattle from a palace in Madrid. In 1700, the pitiable Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, finally succumbed to a lifetime of illness and genetic decay. Childless and tormented, his death left a vacuum at the heart of the largest empire on earth, an empire upon which the sun truly never set, stretching from Naples to the Philippines. The courts of Europe held their breath. When his will was unsealed, it contained a political bombshell. Charles had bequeathed his entire, undivided empire, not to his Austrian Habsburg cousins, but to Philip, Duke of Anjou, the second grandson of Louis XIV. For Louis, it was the ultimate triumph, the crowning achievement of his glorious reign. A Bourbon in Paris, and now a Bourbon in Madrid. The dream of his ancestors, the final checkmate against their Habsburg rivals, was at hand. He famously presented his grandson to the court at Versailles with the triumphant declaration, "Gentlemen, behold the King of Spain." Yet, as Louis celebrated, the rest of Europe recoiled in horror. The specter of a Franco-Spanish superstate, a universal monarchy commanded from Versailles that would dominate the continent and the oceans, was a nightmare they would not permit. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and a coalition of German states immediately forged the Grand Alliance. The War of the Spanish Succession had begun. It was a war on an unprecedented scale, a true world war fought across Europe, on the high seas, and in the distant American colonies. At first, the disciplined French armies, the finest in Europe, seemed invincible. But the long years of conflict began to take their toll. The brilliant generalship of the English Duke of Marlborough and Austria's Prince Eugene of Savoy inflicted a series of stunning and humiliating defeats upon Louis's marshals. As the war dragged on, the glitter of Versailles was paid for by the hunger of the provinces. Brutal winters brought famine, and the relentless taxation needed to fund the armies pushed the French peasantry to the brink of starvation. The Sun King, now an old man, saw his kingdom bleed, his treasury empty, and his own family devastated by disease. His son and eldest grandson died within a year of each other, leaving a fragile great-grandson as the heir. By 1713, a weary and depleted Europe finally made peace. The Treaty of Utrecht was a classic Bourbon compromise. Louis's grandson was recognized as King Philip V of Spain, securing the Spanish throne for the dynasty. But the price was immense. Philip was forced to renounce, for himself and all his descendants, any claim to the French throne, shattering the dream of a unified crown. France ceded vast territories in North America, Newfoundland, Acadia, and the Hudson Bay to Great Britain, which also gained the strategic prizes of Gibraltar and Minorca from Spain. The war had left France bankrupt and surrounded by newly emboldened enemies. When Louis XIV finally died in 1715, after a staggering reign of 72 years, the sun was setting on the grand century. His deathbed advice to his 5-year-old great-grandson and successor, Louis XV, was the poignant whisper of a man haunted by regret. "Do not imitate my love for building and for war. Try to relieve the suffering of your people." It was advice the new era was eager to take. The regency of the Duke of Orléans, a clever and debauched libertine, felt like a great exhalation after the suffocating piety and rigid etiquette of the late Sun King's court. The nobility, freed from their gilded cage, rediscovered their influence. For a time, under the prudent guidance of the aged Cardinal Fleury, who became the young Louis XV's chief minister, France enjoyed a rare period of peace and prosperity. Fleury avoided costly wars, stabilized the currency, and balanced the royal budget. It seemed the kingdom might finally recover. But after Fleury's death in 1743, the character of the king himself came to define the age. Louis XV was not a tyrant. In many ways, he was worse. He was an indifferent king. Handsome, intelligent, and deeply private, he possessed all the attributes of a fine monarch, except the most important one: the will to rule. He found the daily business of governing to be an insufferable bore, and increasingly retreated into his personal pleasures, handing over the reins of power to his influential mistresses, most notably the brilliant and ambitious Madame de Pompadour. She was a patron of the arts and a supporter of the Enlightenment philosophers, but her influence in appointing ministers and generals often proved disastrous for the state. The cautious peace of Fleury's era gave way to a series of expensive and pointless wars. The War of the Austrian Succession cost thousands of French lives for minimal gain. Far more catastrophic was the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Entangled in a European conflict against Prussia, France was simultaneously fighting Great Britain for colonial supremacy. The result was an unmitigated disaster. France lost its vast Canadian empire, its influence in India, and its naval prestige, all while plunging the state deeper into debt. At court, the aura of majesty that had surrounded the Sun King evaporated. Where Louis XIV had used ceremony to project divine authority, Louis XV's court was seen as a den of decadent extravagance and corrupt favoritism. The king was no longer the sacred center of the nation, but a remote and dissolute figure, subject to public criticism and scurrilous satire in cheaply printed pamphlets that circulated through Paris. In the salons of the capital, a new generation of thinkers, Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, were questioning the very foundations of absolute monarchy. They championed reason over tradition, liberty over authority, and constitutional government over divine right. Their ideas, once whispered in private, were now being debated openly, sharpening the intellectual blades for the revolution to come. As the century wore on, the financial crisis worsened. The colossal debts from the wars were compounded by an unjust tax system that exempted the two wealthiest orders, the clergy and the nobility, from the heaviest burdens. Every attempt at reform by courageous finance ministers was defeated by the entrenched opposition of these privileged elites. When Louis XV died of smallpox in 1774, the people of Paris, who had once affectionately called him Le Bien-Aimé, the Well-Beloved, celebrated his passing with open scorn. He left to his grandson, a kind but indecisive young man named Louis XVI, not just a crown, but a kingdom sitting atop a volcano of debt, injustice, and revolutionary fervor. Louis XVI was, by all accounts, a good man. He was pious, devoted to his family, and genuinely wished for the well-being of his subjects. But he had the profound misfortune of being a good man when France desperately needed a great king. He was more comfortable with the intricate mechanics of locks, a personal hobby, than with the complex levers of state. He was shy, cripplingly indecisive, and easily swayed by the last person who had his ear. He inherited a kingdom on the brink of bankruptcy, and he simply lacked the vision and the ruthlessness to save it. His queen, Marie Antoinette, was the daughter of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Their marriage was a political alliance, and she arrived in France a young, isolated foreigner in a court that thrived on intrigue. Vivacious and headstrong, she chafed under the stifling etiquette of Versailles and sought refuge in a world of her own making. Lavish gowns, towering hairdos, and the fantasy world of her private retreat, the Petit Trianon. To a populace struggling with the rising price of bread, her extravagance was not just frivolous, it was a profound insult. She became the target of vicious pamphlets and public hatred, unfairly nicknamed Madame Déficit, the living symbol of a monarchy that feasted while its people starved. The deeper problem, the quiet ticking of the time bomb beneath the throne, was the state's finances. The treasury was empty, drained by the extravagant wars of Louis XV, and in a final, fatal act of irony, by France's support for the American War of Independence. An absolute monarch had bankrupted his nation to help a republic break free from its own king. The paradox was lost on the court, but not on the soldiers and thinkers who saw Republican ideals in action. Now, the bill had come due. The government was hemorrhaging money, paying spiraling interest on its accumulated debt. Time and again, Louis's more capable ministers proposed the only logical solution: a radical reform of the tax system. They argued that the burden must be shared, that the vast, untaxed wealth of the First Estate, the clergy, and the Second Estate, the nobility, must be tapped. And time and again, these privileged orders, using their power in the high courts or parliaments, blocked every reform. They clung fiercely to their ancient exemptions, defending their own purses while the nation slid toward the abyss. They insisted that only one body had the ancient right to approve new taxes: the Estates General, a medieval assembly of the three orders that had not been convened since 1614. It was a political gamble, a power play they believed they could control. They were catastrophically wrong. When the Estates General finally convened at Versailles in the spring of 1789, it was as if 175 years of pent-up grievances were unleashed at once. The deadlock came immediately, not over taxes, but over procedure. Should they vote by order, which would allow the two privileged estates to always outvote the third, or by head, which would give the numerically superior Third Estate representing 97% of the population the advantage? As the debate raged, the representatives of the Third Estate, a dynamic group of lawyers, merchants, and thinkers infused with the spirit of the Enlightenment, took a revolutionary step. On June 20th, finding themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore a solemn oath not to disband until they had given France a constitution. The tennis court oath was an act of epic defiance. It was the moment a group of subjects declared themselves the sovereign National Assembly, the true voice of the nation. As news of their stand electrified Paris, the king wavered. Surrounded by hardline aristocrats at court, he made another fateful error. He began to gather troops around the capital, sparking rumors that he intended to dissolve the assembly by force. Panic and fury gripped the city. On the blistering hot morning of July 14th, a Parisian crowd, desperate for gunpowder to defend themselves, marched on the Bastille, a grim medieval fortress used as a state prison. The Bastille was a symbol of royal despotism, its dark towers looming over the city. After a bloody firefight, the crowd stormed the fortress, murdered its governor, and began to tear it down, stone by stone. The fall of the Bastille was more than the capture of a prison. It was the collapse of a symbol, a seismic event that announced the revolution had truly begun. The king, returning from a hunting trip, was told it was a revolt. "No, sire," a duke replied famously, "it is a revolution." In the countryside, a wave of peasant uprisings known as the Great Fear saw manors burned and feudal records destroyed. In August, the National Assembly, in a feverish all-night session, formally abolished the feudal privileges of the nobility and clergy. They followed this with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that became the gospel of the revolution, proclaiming that all men were born free and equal in rights, and that sovereignty resided not in the king, but in the nation. Louis hesitated, trapped between the revolution in Paris and the reactionary court at Versailles. In October, his indecision proved fatal. Thousands of Parisian women, enraged by the chronic shortage of bread, marched the 12 miles to Versailles, armed with pikes and kitchen knives. They stormed the palace, overwhelmed the guards, and demanded that the royal family, the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy, return with them to Paris. The gilded isolation of Versailles was over. The royal family was escorted to the Tuileries Palace in the heart of the capital, becoming virtual prisoners of the revolution. For 2 years, a fragile constitutional monarchy existed, but the trust between king and people was shattered. In June 1791, Louis made his final, desperate gamble. He and his family, disguised as servants, attempted to flee France and join loyalist armies in the east. They were recognized and captured in the small town of Varennes and brought back to Paris in disgrace. The flight to Varennes destroyed the last vestiges of sacred awe that surrounded the monarchy. The king was no longer a misguided father, he was a traitor. Radical factions gained the upper hand. In August 1792, a revolutionary mob stormed the Tuileries Palace, overthrowing the monarchy in a bloody insurrection. The newly elected National Convention abolished the throne and declared France a republic. The end came swiftly. In January 1793, citizen Louis Capet, stripped of all his titles, was tried for treason against the nation. He was found guilty and, on a cold winter morning, was executed by the new, efficient instrument of revolutionary justice, the guillotine. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette, after a cruel show trial, met the same fate, facing the crowd and the blade with a dignity that had often eluded her in life. The French branch of the House of Bourbon, which had risen from the ashes of the religious wars to become the most powerful dynasty in Europe, had been swept away by a tidal wave of revolution, its absolute power decapitated in the public square. The fall of the guillotine's blade did not end the story of the French Bourbons. It merely scattered it across the map of Europe. While the revolution devoured its own, the executed king's 2 younger brothers, the stout and scholarly Comte de Provence and the dashing reactionary Comte d'Artois, became professional exiles. They drifted from the courts of Austria to Russia to Great Britain, weaving webs of futile plots and issuing grand proclamations to a France that no longer listened. In a Parisian temple prison, Louis XVI's young son, a boy styled by royalists as Louis XVII, suffered a far crueler fate. He was abused, neglected, and died in squalor in 1795, a tragic footnote to the Republic's brutal birth. Upon the news of his nephew's death, the Comte de Provence, from his threadbare court in exile, declared himself King Louis XVIII. He was a king with no kingdom, no army, and no subjects. A spectral monarch haunting the corridors of foreign palaces, while a brilliant and terrifying new star named Napoleon Bonaparte rose to command France and conquer Europe. For 2 decades, the Bourbon name was a relic, a whisper from a buried age. Napoleon, first as consul, then as emperor, redrew the map of Europe, his victories making the Bourbons seem not just obsolete but irrelevant. But empires built on the genius of a single man are inherently fragile. After the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812 and the climactic Battle of the Nations in 1813, Napoleon's empire crumbled. In 1814, the Allied armies British, Russian, Prussian, and Austrian marched into Paris. In need of a legitimate, non-Napoleonic ruler to stabilize France, they turned to the forgotten exile. And so, Louis XVIII, obese, gout-ridden, and having not set foot in his country for over 20 years, returned to France, in the baggage train of the Allies. He was a king nobody had asked for, a ghost returned to a house that had been completely rebuilt. He understood this. Unlike his more rigid brother, Louis XVIII was a pragmatist. He knew he could not simply turn back the clock to 1788. He granted a constitutional charter, a document that attempted to bridge the chasm between the old regime and the new France. It created a parliament, preserved the legal equality and property rights gained during the Revolution, and upheld the Napoleonic Code. But it also declared Catholicism the state religion and vested significant power in the king. He tried to steer a middle course between the ultra-royalists led by his own brother, who wanted vengeance and a full return to absolute monarchy, and the liberals who wanted to push the revolution's ideals further. His reign was immediately tested when Napoleon escaped from his island exile on Elba in 1815. As the emperor marched triumphantly towards Paris, the Bourbon court evaporated, its king fleeing ignominiously back into exile. The 100 days of Napoleon's final gamble ended in the mud and cannon smoke of Waterloo, and Louis XVIII was restored to his throne a second time, now more dependent than ever on foreign bayonets. When he died in 1824, the crown passed to that same unbending brother, who became King Charles X. Where Louis had been a compromiser, Charles was a true believer. He believed in the divine right of kings with an unwavering, catastrophic faith. He compensated the old aristocracy for the lands they had lost, passed laws making sacrilege a capital crime, and sought to restore the church to its former glory. His every move was a deliberate step back into the past, an insult to the spirit of the new France. In July 1830, he issued a series of decrees dissolving Parliament, censoring the press, and restricting voting rights. It was the final provocation. The streets of Paris erupted. For 3 glorious days, les trois glorieuses, students, workers, and the bourgeois middle class threw up barricades and fought the royal troops. Charles X was forced to abdicate and flee to England, the last of the main Bourbon line to rule France. The throne passed not to a republic, but to a distant cousin, Louis-Philippe of the Cadet Bourbon-Orléans branch, a man styled not as the King of France, but as the King of the French, a citizen king for a bourgeois age. Yet his reign, too, would be consumed by revolution in 1848, proving that France's appetite for monarchy, in any form, was exhausted. The Bourbon legacy in their homeland would end not with a bang, but with the quiet death of the last direct claimant in 1883, by which time France had irrevocably embraced its identity as a republic. While the French branch of the family was being consumed by the fires of revolution, their cousins across the Pyrenees were forging an entirely different destiny. We must rewind to that fateful year of 1713, when the Treaty of Utrecht confirmed Louis XIV's grandson, Philip V, on the throne of Spain. The Spain he inherited was a magnificent ruin. It was a vast, sprawling empire, but its heartland was impoverished, its administration sclerotic, and its military a shadow of its former glory. The old Habsburg system of rule through a labyrinth of regional councils and ancient privileges had left the monarchy weak and the nation fragmented. Philip V, raised in the hyper-centralized, efficient court of Versailles, was a man in a hurry. He and his successors were determined to remake Spain in the French image, to import the principles of Bourbon absolutism to their new kingdom. Their project was nothing less than the second conquest of Spain. The first and most dramatic step was the Nueva Planta decrees. These abolished the historic laws, parliaments, and privileges of the constituent kingdoms of the Crown of Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, and Aragon itself, which had backed the rival candidate during the war. They were brought under the unified, centralized legal and administrative framework of Castile. This was a brutal blow to regional identities, but it dramatically strengthened the power of the Madrid monarchy. Philip streamlined the central government, replacing the old councils with ministries of state, finance, justice, and war, modeled directly on the French system. He reformed the tax system to make it more efficient, rebuilt the army and navy along French lines, and encouraged the founding of royal manufactories to produce tapestries, glass, and porcelain, hoping to reduce Spain's reliance on foreign imports. This Bourbon project of modernization, of dragging a reluctant, traditionalist Spain into the 18th century, would define the next 100 years of Spanish history. It was a dynasty not of decline, but of determined, often autocratic, reform. Philip's second wife, the formidable and ambitious Elizabeth Farnese of Parma, pushed Spanish policy aggressively, seeking to reclaim lost Italian territories to create duchies for her own sons. Under her influence, Spain regained control of Naples and Sicily, establishing yet another cadet branch of the Bourbon dynasty that would rule southern Italy until its unification. When Philip's son, Ferdinand VI, inherited the throne, he inherited a kingdom that was more centralized, more solvent, and more powerful than it had been in a century, setting the stage for the golden age of Bourbon Spain under his half-brother, Charles III. When Ferdinand VI died childless in 1759, the Spanish throne passed to his half-brother, Charles III, who was then reigning as King of Naples. Charles's arrival in Spain was like the opening of a window in a stuffy, shuttered room. He was the embodiment of the enlightened despot, a monarch who believed that the cool, clear light of reason, applied from the top down, could strengthen his kingdom and improve the lives of his subjects. He had already spent 2 decades honing his statecraft in Italy, and he arrived in Madrid with a clear vision and a team of capable, reform-minded ministers, men like the Count of Floridablanca and the Marquess of Esquilache. Charles's reign represented the apex of Bourbon reform. He launched a comprehensive overhaul of the state bureaucracy, seeking to replace a system based on privilege and the sale of offices with one based on merit and efficiency. He took on the immense power of the Catholic Church, curbing the authority of the notoriously repressive Inquisition and, in a move that shocked Catholic Europe, expelling the powerful and politically meddlesome Jesuit order from Spain and its entire empire in 1767. He was a builder king, determined to make Madrid a capital worthy of a great European power. Under his patronage, grand neoclassical boulevards, monumental gates like the Puerta de Alcalá, and majestic fountains transformed the city's face. He championed scientific societies, sponsored agricultural reforms, and promoted free trade within the empire. This modernizing zeal extended across the Atlantic. The so-called Bourbon reforms in the Americas were a sweeping attempt to tighten Madrid's control over its vast colonial possessions, increase tax revenues, and streamline defense. New viceroyalties were created, the system of intendants was introduced to improve governance, and crown monopolies were strengthened. While these reforms undoubtedly improved administrative efficiency and boosted the flow of silver to Spain, they came at a cost. They deeply alienated the local-born Creole elites, who found themselves shut out of top positions in favor of officials sent from Spain. In seeking to make the empire more profitable, Charles inadvertently sowed the seeds of the independence movements that would tear it apart a generation later. On the world stage, he avenged some of Spain's earlier losses by shrewdly allying with France and the American colonies against Great Britain during the American Revolutionary War. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 was a moment of triumph, restoring the territories of Florida and Minorca to Spanish rule. But the brilliant twilight of the Spanish Enlightenment gave way to a murky dusk. Charles III died in 1788 and was succeeded by his son, Charles IV. A well-meaning but tragically outmatched king. Where the father was decisive and energetic, the son was weak, indolent, and far more interested in hunting and clockmaking than in the arduous task of governing. Power at court fell into the hands of a poisonous triumvirate: the king himself, his strong-willed and manipulative wife, Maria Luisa of Parma, and her young favorite, a handsome palace guard named Manuel Godoy, whom she elevated with breathtaking speed to the position of chief minister. Godoy's disastrous policies entangled Spain in the whirlwind of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. After a brief and unsuccessful war against revolutionary France, Godoy reversed course and forged an alliance with the new French regime. This pact with the devil would prove fatal. In 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, a combined Franco-Spanish fleet was annihilated by Admiral Nelson's British Navy. The defeat was more than a military loss. It shattered Spanish sea power, leaving its vast overseas empire vulnerable and its own coastline exposed. As Napoleon's star ascended, he treated Spain less like an ally and more like a vassal state, manipulating its court with contemptuous ease. The royal court itself was poisoned by intrigue, as the king's own son and heir, Ferdinand, despised Godoy and plotted against his own parents, hoping to seize the throne. In 1808, Napoleon, the master puppeteer, decided to cut the strings. Under the guise of mediating the family dispute, he lured Charles IV, Maria Luisa, Godoy, and Prince Ferdinand to the French city of Bayonne. It was a trap. Once there, isolated and intimidated, he forced both the aging king and his ambitious son to abdicate their rights to the Spanish throne. With the crown of Spain now effectively in his hands, he gave it to his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Napoleon believed he could simply transfer a kingdom like a piece on a chessboard. He had fundamentally misjudged the Spanish people. While the Bourbon royals had meekly surrendered their crown, the people of Spain refused to surrender their nation. On the 2nd of May, 1808, the Dos de Mayo, the citizens of Madrid rose up in a spontaneous, furious rebellion against the French occupying troops. The uprising was savagely crushed. In the pre-dawn darkness of the following day, French firing squads executed hundreds of captured patriots on a hill outside the city. These raw, brutal events were immortalized by the court painter Francisco Goya, whose masterpieces, the 2nd of May 1808 and the 3rd of May 1808, captured not the glory of battle, but the horror of occupation and the desperate, bloody birth of a nation's resistance. Across the peninsula, provinces formed their own governing councils, or juntas, refusing to recognize the usurper king, and declaring their loyalty to the deposed, and now imprisoned, Ferdinand. The ensuing conflict would not be a conventional war between armies, but a war of national liberation, a brutal, 6-year struggle for survival, known as the Peninsular War, fought by ragtag guerrilla bands and a populace in arms against the most powerful army in the world. The Bourbons had lost their throne, but in doing so, they had accidentally given birth to the modern Spanish nation. The war that followed was a new kind of hell. It was a war fought in sun-scorched mountain passes and in the shadowed alleyways of ancient cities. While British redcoats under the Duke of Wellington engaged the French in conventional set-piece battles, the true war was fought by the Spanish people themselves. It was the war of the guerrilla, the Little War, 1,000 bleeding cuts inflicted by bands of peasants, priests, and smugglers who knew the land and answered to no authority but their own burning hatred for the invader. It was a conflict of unparalleled brutality, where ambushes were met with mass executions, and acts of sabotage were answered with the torching of entire villages. This was the fire in which the Spanish national consciousness was forged. And yet, in the midst of this inferno, a strange and remarkable political experiment was taking place. In the besieged port city of Cadiz, a sliver of land protected by the British fleet, a national assembly known as the Cortes convened. Its members were a collection of liberal thinkers, enlightened clerics, and progressive military men who believed that the fight against the French was not just to restore the old king, but to build a new Spain. In 1812, while the rest of the country was at war, they drafted one of the most radically liberal constitutions in European history. It proclaimed that sovereignty resided not in the king but in the nation. It established a constitutional monarchy with a separation of powers. It abolished feudal privileges and the Inquisition, and it guaranteed freedom of the press. It was a revolutionary document, born of the Enlightenment, written in the name of a king, Ferdinand VII, who was the very symbol of arch-conservative, divine right monarchy. When Napoleon's empire finally collapsed in 1814, Ferdinand was freed and prepared to return to Spain. He was greeted by ecstatic crowds who hailed him as El Deseado, the Desired One. He was the hero who had suffered in their name, the living symbol of their long and bloody struggle for independence. The liberals of the Cortes presented him with their constitution, expecting him to swear an oath to the new Spain they had built. Ferdinand's response was a dagger to the heart of their hopes. He saw the Constitution of 1812 not as a gift, but as an intolerable assault on his God-given authority. He refused to accept it, declared all the acts of the Cortes null and void, and restored absolute monarchy with the stroke of a pen. The very liberals who had governed in his name were now hunted down as traitors. The heroes of the resistance were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The Desired One had become the betrayer king. His reactionary reign stoked the embers of discontent into a constant, simmering fire. The army, which had been politicized during the War for Independence, was now a hotbed of liberal conspiracy. In 1820, a military uprising led by Colonel Rafael del Riego forced Ferdinand to restore the constitution, inaugurating a 3-year period known as the Trienio Liberal. But Spain's liberal experiment was an island in a sea of reactionary European powers. In 1823, in a bitter historical irony, a French army sent by the restored Bourbon King of France, Louis XVIII, marched into Spain to crush the liberal government and restore Ferdinand VII to his full absolutist powers. The repression that followed was even harsher than before. Ferdinand's reign was a political disaster, but his final act would plunge Spain into a cycle of civil war that would haunt it for a century. The king's several marriages had produced daughters, but no surviving sons. According to the Salic law, a French custom imported by the first Bourbon king, Philip V, women were barred from the throne. The heir apparent was therefore Ferdinand's younger brother, Carlos, a man of rigid, ultra-reactionary beliefs. But Ferdinand, doting on his infant daughter, Isabella, was determined that she should succeed him. In 1830, he issued a pragmatic sanction, revoking the Salic law and positioning Isabella as his heir. This was no mere family squabble. It was the spark that ignited the two warring souls of Spain. The cause of Isabella, guided by her regent mother Maria Cristina, became the cause of the liberals, who saw a female monarch and a long regency as their best hope for constitutional reform. The cause of Carlos was taken up by those who saw the pragmatic sanction as an illegal act and a betrayal of sacred tradition. These were the Carlistas, the Carlists. They were the defenders of an old mythical Spain, of absolute monarchy, of the unquestioned supremacy of the Catholic Church, and of the ancient regional charters, the fueros, especially in the Basque provinces and Navarre, which they felt were threatened by liberal centralization. When Ferdinand VII finally died in 1833, his 3-year-old daughter was proclaimed Queen Isabella II. Almost immediately, in the mountains of the north, her uncle declared himself King Carlos V. The First Carlist War had begun. What started as a dynastic dispute had metastasized into an ideological civil war, a brutal, deeply personal conflict that pitted city against countryside, liberal against traditionalist, and neighbor against neighbor. For the next 7 years, Spain would once again bleed, fighting over the very definition of its identity, a struggle born from a dying king's love for his daughter and the deep, irreconcilable fractures within the House of Bourbon itself. The First Carlist War was a war of the crucifix and the knife, a 7-year struggle fought with a savage intimacy that left scars on the Spanish soul for generations. In the rugged mountains of the Basque country and the fields of Catalonia, Carlist forces, led by the brilliant guerrilla tactician Tomás de Zumalacárregui, waged a holy war for God, country, and king. The liberal armies, fighting for Queen Isabella and the promise of a modern, centralized state, responded with equal ferocity. Villages were cleaved in two, families were torn apart, and the conflict became a grim catalogue of sieges and reprisals. The war finally ended in 1839, not with a decisive battle, but with a symbolic embrace. At the embrace of Vergara, many exhausted Carlist officers agreed to recognize Isabella in exchange for a promise to respect some Basque privileges. Carlos went into exile, but the Carlist cause did not die. It retreated into the mountains and the churches, a dormant but potent ideology, ready to erupt whenever the liberal state faltered. The Spain that emerged was nominally ruled by Queen Isabella II, who came of age in 1843. Her long reign was not an era of stability, but a chaotic procession of political crises, military coups, and courtly scandals. Isabella was not a malevolent ruler, but she was a product of her cloistered upbringing, poorly educated, impulsive, and surrounded by a camarilla of reactionary advisors, opportunistic generals, and court favorites. Her court became a hotbed of intrigue and gossip, a gilded cage where political power was traded for personal favors, entirely detached from the grinding poverty of the nation. Real power in Isabella's Spain lay not in the palace, but in the barracks. The age was dominated by military strongmen, generals like the conservative Ramón María Narváez and the progressive Baldomero Espartero, who treated the government as a revolving door. These were the espadones, the big swords, and they made and unmade governments through the uniquely Spanish political tool of the pronunciamiento, the military coup. A constitution would be written, a government formed, only for a disgruntled general to pronounce against it, march his troops on Madrid, and start the cycle anew. While Britain and France were building industrial empires, Spain was trapped in this debilitating loop of instability, its economic modernization lagging, its politics a tragic farce. By the 1862, the patience of the Spanish people had worn thin. The Queen's legitimacy was in tatters, shredded by corruption scandals, rigged elections, and her increasingly reactionary policies. A broad coalition of opposition began to form, uniting strange bedfellows, progressive liberals who had once supported her, radical Democrats, and even disgruntled moderate generals. In 1868, the final act began. Under the leadership of General Juan Prim and Admiral Juan Bautista Topete, a pronunciamiento was launched in Cadiz. But this was different. Their cry was not simply for a new government, but for a new Spain. Viva España con honra! Long live Spain with honor! The revolution, known as La Gloriosa, swept the country. The Queen's armies melted away, and without a fight, Isabella II, the last reigning Bourbon of the direct line, fled into exile in France. The Bourbons were gone, but the throne remained. Spain was now a kingdom without a king, a nation adrift. The provisional government, led by General Serrano, drafted a new, genuinely democratic constitution in 1869, which established freedom of religion, universal male suffrage, and a constitutional monarchy. Now, they just had to find a monarch willing to take the job. The search became a humiliating diplomatic spectacle, as the Spanish crown was offered around the courts of Europe like an unwanted inheritance. A German prince's candidacy so alarmed France that it helped trigger the Franco-Prussian War. Finally, they settled on Amadeo of Savoy, the second son of the King of Italy, a liberal prince with a reputation for constitutional propriety. Amadeo's reign was doomed from the start. He arrived in Spain in December 1870, only to be greeted with the shocking news that his chief sponsor, the brilliant General Prim, had just been assassinated in the streets of Madrid. Alone, a stranger in a land he could not comprehend, King Amadeo struggled to navigate Spain's political vortex. The Carlists, sensing weakness, launched their third major uprising in the north. Republicans agitated constantly for the end of monarchy. The aristocracy viewed him as a foreign intruder, and the common people were indifferent. He tried to be a model constitutional king, but he had no base of support. In February 1873, after just 2 years of frustration and facing constant threats to his life, he did something almost unheard of for a monarch. He quit. He abdicated the throne, famously declaring that the Spanish people were ungovernable. His abdication left a total power vacuum. In desperation, the Cortes proclaimed the First Spanish Republic. It was an experiment born not of widespread Republican conviction, but of the utter failure of all other options. It descended into chaos almost immediately. The Republicans themselves were hopelessly divided between those who wanted a centralized, unitary republic and Federalists who wished to create a federation of autonomous regions. Carlist forces made huge gains in the north, and in the south, a new, even more radical movement erupted: the Cantonalist insurrections, in which cities like Cartagena declared themselves independent city-states. Spain was disintegrating. Amid the chaos, the army, the traditional arbiter of Spanish politics, decided that the experiment had failed. In December 1874, General Arsenio Martínez Campos led his troops in a pronunciamiento at Sagunto. He declared his support not for the disgraced Isabella, but for her young son, Alfonso. Worn out by revolution, republicanism, and civil war, the political class and much of the nation rallied to his call. The boy who would become Alfonso XII was proclaimed king, and the House of Bourbon, against all odds, returned to Spain. The man who returned the Bourbons to Spain was not a king, but a shrewd, cynical politician named Antonio Cánovas del Castillo. He had witnessed the chaos of Isabella's reign, the farce of the king hunt, and the bloody anarchy of the First Republic, and he drew a cold, hard conclusion. Spain was a sick patient, and what it needed was not a miracle cure, but a long, managed convalescence. The system he designed for the restored monarchy was a masterpiece of political engineering, a constitution that looked liberal on paper but was, in practice, a meticulously controlled stage play. This was the era of the Restoration, an attempt to finally bring stability to a nation weary of revolution. At the heart of Cánovas's system was the Turno Pacifico, The peaceful turn. Two great political parties, his own conservatives and a rival liberal party, would politely alternate in power. This was not a democracy in the true sense. It was a pact between elites, designed to keep the army out of politics and to exclude the real threats to their order. The Carlists on the far right and the Republicans and Socialists on the far left. Elections were a carefully choreographed affair. The king would call on the opposition leader to form a government, and only then would an election be held. The outcome was predetermined through a nationwide network of political bosses known as caciques. These local grandees, landowners, industrialists, priests controlled votes through a mixture of patronage, intimidation, and outright fraud, delivering precisely the parliamentary majority the new government required. It was a hollow democracy, but for a time, it worked. It provided a veneer of parliamentary procedure and, most importantly, it stopped the constant cycle of military coups. King Alfonso XII, the young monarch at the center of this system, proved to be its greatest asset. He was charming, pragmatic, and possessed a talent for reconciliation. His brief reign was marked by the final defeat of the Carlists in 1876, officially ending the last great Carlist war and leading to the abolition of the last of the Basque fueros. He also oversaw the temporary end to a long-running colonial war in Cuba. He was the peacemaker king, and his popularity gave the fragile new system a much-needed legitimacy. Tragically, he died of tuberculosis in 1885, at the age of just 27, leaving behind a pregnant wife, Queen Maria Christina of Austria. When she gave birth to a son several months later, the infant Alfonso XIII became king at the moment of his birth, with his dignified and capable mother ruling as regent for the next 16 years. Alfonso XIII came of age and took the throne in 1902, inheriting a Spain that was straining at the seams of Canavas's artificial system. While the political elite in Madrid played their game of Turno, the real Spain was changing. In the industrializing regions of Catalonia and the Basque Country, a new urban working class was growing, drawn to the radical doctrines of anarchism and socialism. At the same time, powerful nationalist movements were emerging in these regions, demanding recognition for their unique languages and cultures, and greater autonomy from the centralized Castilian state. In the vast, sun-baked plains of Andalusia, landless peasants, trapped in a quasi-feudal system, listened with growing hope to anarchist agitators who promised a new dawn of social revolution. The controlled rotation of the two establishment parties was utterly incapable of addressing these deep social and regional fissures. The first great shock to this fragile world came not from within, but from across the sea. In 1898, Spain stumbled into a short, humiliating war with a rising power, the United States. The conflict was a catastrophic mismatch. In a matter of months, the decrepit Spanish navy was sent to the bottom of the sea, and Spain lost the last jewels of its once mighty empire: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The disaster of '98 was a profound national trauma. It was not just a military defeat, it was the final, undeniable proof of Spain's decay. It stripped away the last illusions of imperial greatness and forced the nation into a painful period of introspection, giving rise to a brilliant group of writers and intellectuals, the generation of '98, who performed a stark and unflinching autopsy on the corpse of their country. The early 20th century saw the system slide further into crisis. In 1909, social tensions in Barcelona exploded into a week of violent anti-clerical rioting and striking, known as the Tragic Week Abroad. A new colonial misadventure in Morocco turned into a bleeding ulcer, culminating in the horrific Battle of Annual in 1921, where an entire Spanish army was wiped out by Rif Berber tribesmen. Public outrage over the incompetence and corruption that led to the disaster reached a fever pitch, threatening to bring down the entire system. It was in this moment of crisis that King Alfonso XIII made his most fateful decision. In 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera, the Captain General of Catalonia, led a military coup. Instead of defending the constitution he had sworn to uphold, Alfonso XIII gave the coup his blessing. He saw the general as a strong man who could restore order and discipline to a chaotic nation. Primo de Rivera suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and established a military dictatorship that would last for 7 years. He was a modernizer in the authoritarian mold, building roads, dams, and infrastructure. But he did so while brutally suppressing all political dissent, censoring the press, and crushing the labor and nationalist movements. The king, by tying his own fate to that of the dictator, had abandoned his role as a neutral, constitutional monarch. By 1930, the dictatorship, weakened by the Great Depression and growing opposition, had run its course, and Primo de Rivera resigned. The king attempted to steer the country back to the old constitutional system, but it was too late. He had fatally compromised the monarchy. In April 1931, nationwide municipal elections were held. They were intended to be a simple local affair, but everyone understood them to be a referendum on the king himself. The results were a political earthquake. While monarchist parties won in the conservative countryside, Republican candidates swept to victory in nearly every major city. The message was unmistakable. When the results came in, vast, joyous crowds poured into the streets of Madrid, Barcelona, and Seville, not with rifles and barricades, but with the purple, red, and gold flags of the long-dreamed of republic. Alfonso XIII, watching the scene unfold from his palace, made a final, dignified choice. To avoid plunging his country into a civil war, he chose exile. Without formally abdicating, he quietly left Madrid that night. The next day, the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed, and the Bourbon throne, which had been restored through exhaustion and managed by artifice, was once again empty.